May your word only be spoken, O Christ, and your word only be heard. Amen. O house of Jacob, come, let us walk in the light of the Lord. And so the prophet Isaiah exhorts us to begin a new season this morning, to begin our journey of Advent today, the 4 weeks of watching and waiting until the Christ comes again. And this is now the time of year when darkness sets in early, and to defy the darkness, we are going to set out bright lights all over the neighborhood and make good cheer with parties, right? We're going to light the Advent wreath here in church to remind ourselves that light is a gift and a blessing, and that it can be something very sacred. You know, light became critical to 2 missionaries in Ghana, West Africa, when they were assigned to a bush hospital in an area that was full of snakes, green and black mambas, vipers, spitting cobras. Rebecca and Mary were these 2 missionaries, and they got used to the snakes fairly soon there in West Ghana. But their friends who would come over to visit them for the monthly meeting, the area meeting, their friends never got used to these snakes that would be lurking about, especially in the dark. So Rebecca and Gary, the 2 young missionaries, would walk their friends back to their cars after meeting with them, and they walked through the grass. Their friends were just petrified going through the grass. They didn't want to disturb any sleeping snakes, any slithering creatures. So Rebecca would bring her big flashlight to shine the path to the cars and just say to her friends, walk in the light, walk in the light, walk in the light. Light becomes so precious when it protects you that way. There's a famous African hymn, very popular in the last 20 years or so. We are walking in the light of God. Do you know that one? We sang it at our diocesan convention last Sunday. Your delegates, Gail Fick and Peg Hodgkins, and your clergy. We were in the big Connecticut Convention Center, and we sang it to the accompaniment of steel drums. It was really joyful. You're marching in the light of God. And the song says, you know, it can be dark outside, but when we have faith, God's light guides us, and we don't have to be afraid. We don't have to be fearful. Back in the year 1999, I went on a church trip to our companion diocese in Mozambique, which was then the 4th poorest country in the world. I was with another priest, a junior warden, and a nun, and our mission was to bring a second installment of solar pumps so the people of the villages in this diocese could get water more easily. We stayed together in a small house in the village of Libombos. Our hosts had given us the nicest home that they had, and each evening we'd be invited to dinner at the bishop's house in Libombos. We were greeted at the door of his home with a basin and a pitcher, a young man pouring a pitcher of water to wash our hands. The food they offered us was the best they had. The hospitality was amazing. And then the village generator would crank up and turn on until exactly 8 o'clock and it would shut off. And that provided sporadic electricity for a couple hours each night. At 8 o'clock, everything went dark. And remembering the difference those few hours of electricity meant to the villagers reminded me of things that I take for granted back home. Once the lights went out, my roommates and I went right to sleep at 8 o'clock because there was nothing to do in the dark, really. And the roosters outside our window would be up at 4 a.m. anyway. Might as well get some rest. But resting, I found so hard there in the darkness. I'd hear the chirping of crickets and bugs and clickings and rustlings. It would make me nervous. I felt like a little child again. A child that would fitfully roll over and over. It just felt fearful. I would wait for the light of the morning to arrive. All of our lives, we can live in a spiritual darkness until one day we have a revelation that God is with us and that we are beloved. And the dawning of that day is like when a day. That's what he lived on. He expected to die out there in the streets like his friend that they call Red-Faced, who died an alcoholic, sadly. But one day, something happened to Cadillac Man. This woman walked under the viaduct, and her name was Carol Vogel, and she fell in love with him. And he said, she saw me as a human being, not as a homeless guy. And that changed his life, especially because it meant he'd have to start a new life indoors. It was the first bed that Cadillac Man had slept in so long that wasn't an abandoned car or in the company of rats. And the indoor heat, the warm light, it seemed like such a novelty. Cadillac Man, he's a writer now, he said, sometimes I miss the streets, but he doesn't want to lose Carol. Carol is the warmth and the light that was missing from his life, that loving presence which, by the grace of God, passed under the viaduct that day. I think the promise of Advent is that the light is coming again to a dark world. Advent promises something beautiful, a day when God's kingdom comes and God's will is finally done on earth as it is in heaven. That's the day that all the prophets call the day of the Lord. That is the promise. So to practice waiting for that day is what we're going to do this season, the next 4 weeks before Christmas. It's a spiritual quest, and Jesus says, this waiting time, we've got to be super alert, sober. Try to prepare for the coming of the Lord's day. And so this month we can make choices about our words and our actions, choices about our behavior, and we can lay aside the works of darkness and the works of division consciously. So to make these choices, we look to the light of the gospel, don't we? And it opens up the path for us. We look to the things that Jesus taught us, things that we've heard before, but now, especially in this season, we can consciously practice being the people that Jesus calls us to be. By loving our neighbor as we would like to be loved ourselves. By working on making our homes a place of peace and quietness. By forgiving one person every day. Maybe by listening to one person every day. By practicing thankfulness, because G.K. Chesterton wrote several decades back, he said, gratitude is the highest form of thought. It is happiness doubled by wonder. Don't you love that? Happiness doubled by wonder. And lastly, by sharing and praying. Christ can show up at any time. We don't know when it's going to happen. Will he find us distracted by the glow of our phones? Or will he find us being children of the day? Lying on that bed in Mozambique, not quite 20 years ago, I realized that my fear of bugs and the unknown would get the best of me if I didn't have faith that the Lord was with me through the night. And those missionaries, Rebecca and Gary, who were not afraid of snakes in the Ghana bush, they had the grace to offer a flashlight path to their friends, to point the way to the cars, to point the way to safety. So the faith we learn in the ordinary days which are not a crisis prepares us to get through the hard times, the darker times. Faith offers us the hope and the path to follow. So come, brothers and sisters, let us walk in the light